Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink into one of history's strangest roles. Not king, not queen, not even royal concubine, but the ones hovering just outside all of those categories. The men who weren't really men anymore, yet somehow ended up shaping empires. Yeah, tonight, we're talking about eunuchs. It sounds harsh right away. The word itself almost feels like a cough, but for centuries, especially in Asia and the Middle East, being a eunuch was practically a career path. Parents would send their sons to be, well, trimmed, if it meant a shot at influence in the imperial court. Because apparently, losing your manhood was just part of climbing the social ladder. Now, imagine this. You're a young boy, somewhere in the countryside, and your family is dirt poor. The empire's recruiters roll in, whispering promises. They say, your son could serve the emperor. He could eat rich food, sleep under silk, and bring honor to your name. Sounds tempting, right? But of course, the catch is, they'll have to make a little adjustment. By little, I mean the kind of adjustment you don't recover from. And so, whole dynasties of eunuchs were created. They weren't exactly nobles, but they weren't commoners either. They floated in this bizarre middle space, not quite fully trusted, but close enough to whisper in the emperor's ear. Which, let's be honest, is way more power than most intact men ever got. So tonight, we'll walk slowly through their strange world. The politics, the humiliations, the wealth, and the weird, lonely status of men who technically weren't men anymore. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin drifting into the shadowy corridors of palace life, where the eunuchs waited. So here's the thing about eunuchs. They were both everywhere and nowhere. In the records, they show up constantly. Scribes, guards, messengers, tutors, even generals. But at the same time, their names often just dissolve into the background. Because history, in its usual blunt style, didn't always bother remembering the guy who ran half the empire's paperwork, just because he happened to lack certain equipment. And yet, rulers trusted them. Why? Because a eunuch was never going to start a dynasty. He couldn't exactly get married, father sons, and build some rival family line to threaten the throne. So emperors thought, perfect. I'll surround myself with men who literally can stab me in the back with an air. Of course, that didn't stop eunuchs from scheming, and they were fantastic at scheming. If you're not busy building a family, you've got a lot more time to plot everyone else's downfall. Some of the most infamous palace coups in history were engineered by eunuchs who were supposed to be harmless servants. Spoiler, they weren't. But their daily life wasn't always glamorous plotting. Picture them as the invisible gears of palace life. One eunuch would manage the kitchens. Another would oversee the treasury. A third would keep watch over the emperor's private chambers, which, by the way, is code for keeping tabs on the emperor's very large harem. And who better to guard a palace full of women than a man who wasn't, let's say, fully functional? It was like history's most awkward job requirement. And yet, that gave them incredible intimacy with power. When the emperor woke up, it was often a eunuch standing by with his clothes. When a concubine whispered secrets, it was usually a eunuch listening at the curtains. When foreign envoys arrived, eunuchs were often the ones interpreting, arranging, and deciding who got access. They were, in short, the palace ghosts, always there, always watching, not fully trusted, not fully free. Now, depending on where you were in the world, being a eunuch could mean very different things. In China, for example, it was basically an entire profession. By the Ming Dynasty, there were thousands of eunuchs working in the Forbidden City alone. Thousands. Imagine an army of pale silk-robed men shuffling down long red corridors, each one carrying scrolls, food trays, or secrets. Some of them lived quiet, obedient lives. Others clawed their way into history. Take Wei Zhongxian, for example. He started as just another eunuch in the Ming court, polishing floors and running errands. But through careful manipulation, and by cozying up a little too closely with the emperor's favorite concubine, He rose so high that people started calling him the 9,000-year-old, which sounds like a fairy tale title, but was basically a way of saying, this man is second only to the emperor. Of course, it didn't end well. Spoiler alert, power in an imperial court almost never does. When a new faction came in, Wei Zhongxian's enemies made sure he retired permanently. Still, the fact that a man with no heirs, no official noble blood, and no physical legacy could run half the empire, that says a lot about how slippery palace politics really were. Meanwhile, over in the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs held a very different spotlight. They were the gatekeepers of the Sultan's harem. Picture that, hundreds of concubines, lavish gardens, glittering chambers, and a wall of silent, watchful eunuchs standing guard. They weren't just bodyguards, they were the filters. If you wanted access to the Sultan, you went through them first, which meant that while they technically had no families of their own, they had enormous influence over who became family to the throne. So whether you were in Beijing or Istanbul, the life of a eunuch wasn't just about survival, it was about being the invisible hinge on which the palace door turned. Not exactly glamorous, not exactly enviable, but strangely powerful. Life as a eunuch wasn't just politics and palace whispers though. There was also the very real, very physical reality of, well, the operation itself. And here's where history gets uncomfortably honest. In many places, becoming a eunuch wasn't a delicate medical procedure. It was often crude, dangerous, and done without much thought to survival rates. In China, the standard method was complete removal. Everything gone, not just a partial adjustment. The surgery was usually performed by specialists, who would hand the unfortunate boy a tiny tube, slip it into place, and hope that when the wound healed, he'd still be able to urinate. Success meant a new life in the palace. Failure, well, let's just say a lot of families lost sons in the attempt. But here's the strange part. Despite the danger, parents still volunteered their children. Poverty has a way of making even the most brutal choices seem like opportunities. A life of silk and steady meals in the palace was worth gambling against the odds. Better to be a living eunuch than a starving farmer. And once inside, survival meant learning the art of silence. Eunuchs weren't supposed to be loud, flashy, or defiant. The ideal eunuch was like furniture, always present, always useful, never noticed. But of course, humans don't really work that way. Even the quietest servant wanted recognition. And so you'd see these little bursts of personality peek through. A eunuch who decorated his robes just a bit too extravagantly. One who whispered jokes with the palace guards. Another who, against all logic, became the emperor's drinking companion. And because their lives were so strange and so narrow, eunuchs developed a reputation for being both cunning and bitter. Outsiders called them schemers, tricksters, manipulators. But really, what else could they be? When your body has been taken from you, when family is denied to you, when your only chance at meaning is serving a master who might kill you on a whim, plotting becomes second nature. So they learned to listen more than they spoke, to wait longer than anyone else could stand, and to strike, not with swords, but with whispered words at just the right moment. If there's one thing eunuchs became legendary for, it was their talent for gossip. Picture the palace as a giant, echoing hive, the emperor at the center, courtiers buzzing around him, concubines fluttering in gilded cages. And then, tucked into every hallway, every doorway, every shadow, were the eunuchs, watching, listening, remembering. They weren't supposed to have power of their own, but information is power. And who knew more than the man who dressed the emperor in the morning, or the one who carried notes between concubines, or the one who stood by while officials argued outside the throne room? Eunuchs were like walking archives. They stored whispers the way treasuries stored gold. And in a world where the wrong rumor could topple a dynasty that made them dangerous, take the Ottoman court. By the 17th century, the chief black eunuch was one of the most important people in the empire. He wasn't just guarding the harem, though yes, that was part of it. He was also managing vast estates, controlling charitable foundations, and deciding which concubine got to share the sultan's bed. Imagine being the filter between the world's most powerful man and his most intimate choices. It's no wonder sultans sometimes treated their chief eunuchs like family or like enemies, depending on the day. Meanwhile, in China, eunuchs weren't just guarding women. They were running entire government offices. Whole departments of the Ming dynasty were staffed and supervised by eunuchs. Scholars hated this, of course. Confucian officials wrote endless essays about how eunuchs were corrupt, sneaky, and unfit for governance. And maybe some of that was true. But emperors liked them because they were loyal, or at least loyal enough until a better bribe came along. It's ironic, really. The very thing that made eunuchs supposedly safe, the fact that they couldn't pass power down to sons, also made them reckless. With no heirs to think about, they could gamble everything on the emperor's favor. Rise fast, fall faster. One day, you're drinking from gold cups. The next, you're strangled with a silk cord. Such was the strange, floating existence of palace eunuchs. Not quite men, not quite invisible, always walking that razor-thin line between service and dominance. Let's stay in China for a while, because honestly, nobody perfected the eunuch industry quite like the Chinese imperial courts. By the time of the Ming dynasty, there were tens of thousands of them inside the Forbidden City. Tens of thousands. Imagine an entire city within a city, filled with clipped voices and careful steps. Every one of them bound to the emperor in the most literal way possible. At first, the emperors tried to keep them in check. There were strict rules. Eunuchs weren't supposed to read or write, weren't supposed to meddle in government, weren't supposed to be more than household servants. Which, if you've learned anything about history, you already know. Rules like that exist because someone always breaks them. And they broke them spectacularly. Take the Yongle Emperor's court. He's the one who sent out Zheng He, the famous explorer. Now, Zheng He wasn't just some sailor plucked off the docks. He was a eunuch admiral. Yes, the man who commanded vast fleets, sailed to Africa, and collected giraffes for the emperor's zoo, had been castrated as a boy and raised in the palace. That's the kind of career twist no guidance counselor could have predicted. And Zheng He wasn't alone. Eunuchs became generals, governors, spies, and cultural patrons. Some built libraries, others sponsored plays. A few, naturally, became expert embezzlers, siphoning off palace silver until the treasury wheezed. Confucian scholars fumed, of course. They called eunuchs parasites, termites, locusts, eating away at the state. And maybe they weren't entirely wrong. But emperors kept trusting them anyway. Why? Because unlike the scholars, eunuchs had no powerful clans backing them. No father-in-law whispering in their ear. No sons to inherit offices. Just raw dependence on imperial favor. It was a devil's bargain. The eunuchs gave up their manhood in exchange for access. The emperors gave up a little stability in exchange for loyalty. And both sides pretended this arrangement wasn't laced with resentment. So when you picture the Ming court, don't just imagine scholars in flowing robes and emperors on golden thrones. Picture the quiet shuffle of silk slippers in the corridors, the watchful eyes behind fans, the whispers of eunuchs, holding more power than their bodies would ever suggest. If you really want to see how far eunuchs could push the limits of power, look at the late Ming dynasty. By then, the empire was practically drowning in them. Records say there were around 70,000 eunuchs in service. 70,000. That's not a support staff. That's a small army. And with numbers like that, some were bound to rise above the rest. The most infamous of all was Wei Zhengshun, our earlier 9,000-year-old. He started out lowly, worked his way into the palace, and then, through charm, ruthlessness, and a talent for backroom deals, ended up controlling the emperor himself. Wei was like the nightmare version of a corporate manager. He installed his friends in top offices, purged his enemies with brutal efficiency, and even had temples built in his honor while he was still alive. That's usually a sign you've gotten a little too comfortable. Scholars tried to resist, but resistance meant exile, prison, or worse. Wei ran the empire like his personal company until the emperor died, and then, predictably, his enemies tore him down. His body didn't even get a dignified ending. But Wei was just the loudest example. The whole system was prone to abuse. Eunuchs ran secret police forces. They monitored letters, spied on governors, and tortured confessions out of anyone who looked suspicious. Imagine walking down a Beijing street, glancing over your shoulder, and wondering if the quiet man in silk robes with a soft voice was about to ruin your career with a whisper. That was Ming paranoia in a nutshell. And yet, it wasn't all corruption. Some eunuchs were genuinely loyal, genuinely capable. Zhang Yi is still celebrated in China today. Others funded schools, restored temples, or kept the palace running with meticulous care. The truth is, eunuchs were like any other power-hungry group, some noble, some greedy, all shaped by a system that forced them into strange, lonely roles. The irony, the scholars who hated them so much often needed them too. Need a message delivered to the emperor. You went through a eunuch, need your petition heard. Same deal. In the Forbidden City, nothing moved without their touch. So when you think about Ming China collapsing under corruption and rebellion, don't just blame emperors or scholars. Blame the palace ghosts too. The silent army of eunuchs who kept the machine humming until they pushed it too far. Life for a Chinese eunuch wasn't always about high politics, though for most of them, it was the small, endless routines of palace life. Waking before dawn, polishing bronze vessels until they shone, carrying trays of food that they'd never get to eat, guarding hallways that felt more like gilded cages than corridors. And because they lived so close together, thousands of men in narrow dormitories inside the Forbidden City, they developed their own strange subculture. Friendships, rivalries, little hierarchies. A senior eunuch might have a cluster of juniors serving under him, almost like a makeshift family. Of course, it wasn't the kind of family most people would recognize. There were no sons to carry on their names, no daughters to marry off. Their legacy was their influence, their reputation, and maybe a shrine built in their honor if they were especially lucky. Some, unable to handle the loneliness, tried to adopt children in secret. A few even bought boys from poor families to raise as heirs. Though technically, this was illegal. Others poured their energy into art, calligraphy, or Buddhist devotion, carving out meaning where they could. It was a quiet kind of tragedy. Men cut off from the natural rhythm of life, improvising substitutes in the cracks of palace walls. And yet, they laughed too. Court diaries mention eunuchs joking with guards, gossiping about concubines, and occasionally pulling pranks on junior officials. Because even in the strangest conditions, people will always find ways to be human. By the time the Ming dynasty finally collapsed in the 1600s, the eunuch system was so bloated that rebels storming the Forbidden City made a special point of killing them. To ordinary Chinese, eunuchs had become symbols of everything corrupt and parasitic about imperial rule. The irony. Many of them had been poor boys, sacrificed by their families in hopes of a better life. They rose high, they fell hard, and in the end, history mostly remembers them as shadows. And with that, we can quietly slip out of Beijing's red gates and start drifting westward, toward Constantinople, where eunuchs weren't just palace servants, but bishops, generals, and sometimes kingmakers in their own right. In Byzantium, eunuchs weren't just tolerated. They were practically a political class of their own. If China gave us the image of palace ghosts in silk slippers, Byzantium gave us something closer to glittering courtiers with crosses around their necks, half priests, half politicians, always in the emperor's orbit. Why did Byzantines value them so much? Well, for the same old reason. Trust. A eunuch couldn't start a family dynasty to challenge the emperor. But unlike in China, Byzantium didn't just see them as servants. They were seen as uniquely suited to sacred and political roles. Somehow, their condition was considered both a physical loss and a kind of spiritual purity, which is a very Byzantine mix of tragic and convenient. Some of the most powerful men in the empire were eunuchs. They weren't just chamberlains or guards. They were generals leading armies, patriarchs guiding the church, and advisors shaping imperial policy. Imagine an empire where half the major figures at court had been altered before puberty. It gave the Byzantine elite a strange, almost androgynous aura, glittering robes, smooth faces, and voices that sometimes never dropped. It must have felt like walking through a world just slightly tilted off balance. And of course, there were scandals. Theophylact, the son of an emperor, was castrated as a child on purpose so that he could rise in the church without ever being a threat to the throne. Others weren't born into it at all, but were forcibly converted later in life, usually to neutralize them as rivals. It was both punishment and promotion. Lose your manhood, gain a career. One chronicler even joked that the Byzantine court was a half-man's paradise. Cruel words, but not far off. Eunuchs became the glue of the empire. Not quite men, not quite outside the system. Always useful, always suspect, and always lingering in the background of Byzantine politics. Let's start with Basil Lecapenus, because honestly, if eunuchs had a hall of fame, he'd be front and center. Basil was the illegitimate son of Emperor Romanos I. And as if being born out of wedlock wasn't awkward enough, he was castrated as a child to make sure he'd never threaten the throne. Brutal, yes. But also, in a weird way, it cleared his path. Because, instead of fighting cousins for crowns or squabbling over marriages, Basil went straight into palace service. And there, he thrived. He rose to become Parakoimonos, which literally means the guy who sleeps next to the emperor. Don't overthink it. It wasn't romantic. It meant he was the chamberlain, the one with direct, daily access to the emperor's person. And in Byzantium, that kind of access was worth more than gold. For decades, Basil was the real power behind the throne. Emperors came and went, some capable, some hopeless, but Basil was a constant. He managed finances, shaped policy, and whispered in royal ears. He was careful, calculating, and just detached enough from worldly ties to make everyone both trust him and fear him. And he wasn't alone. The Byzantine court was practically crawling with eunuchs in high places. Some commanded armies, like Narses, a brilliant general under Justinian who smashed the Ostrogoths in Italy. Imagine that, a eunuch leading legions, riding into battle, and being respected by hardened soldiers. It shattered the stereotype of eunuchs as soft, decorative courtiers. Narses proved they could be ruthless warlords too. But the Byzantines also had a dark habit, castrating political rivals. If a nobleman fell out of favor, the emperor might have him quietly adjusted. It was the empire's way of saying, "You'll never sit on the throne now, but we'll find a use for you." Cruel, absolutely effective, very. Some of those unwilling eunuchs went on to hold immense power anyway, turning their mutilation into a strange kind of second career. So in Byzantium, being a eunuch wasn't the end. Sometimes it was the beginning. Basil Lecapenus is fascinating because he managed the impossible, staying in power through emperor after emperor. Think about that. In a system where rulers could be deposed overnight, poisoned at dinner, or shuffled off to a monastery with a shaved head, Basil somehow kept his position. He was like a shadow stitched into the very walls of the palace. But survival came at a cost. Chroniclers describe him as cautious, calculating, and sometimes bitter. He couldn't have heirs, so he poured his energy into wealth instead. Basil owned vast estates, so vast, in fact, that later emperors had to confiscate them just to stop him from overshadowing the throne. Imagine being so rich, the emperor has to step in and say, "Okay, that's enough for you." And then there was Narses, the general. His story shows another side of the eunuch paradox. Narses was small, frail-looking, and already in his 70s when Justinian sent him to lead an army. Everyone assumed it was a joke. But Narses turned out to be a master strategist. He crushed the Ostrogoths at the Battle of Taginae in 552, practically ending Gothic power in Italy. Soldiers who once sneered at him ended up following him with absolute loyalty. A eunuch leading rough, battle-scarred warriors. It was the kind of irony Byzantium specialized in. And then, of course, there were the religious roles. Eunuchs often rose to high ranks in the Byzantine church. Their lack of family ties made them seem more pure in the eyes of some, as though castration had stripped away temptation itself, which is a grim way to look at holiness. But Byzantium was nothing if not creative in its theology. So, between the palace, the battlefield, and the church, eunuchs carved out niches of influence everywhere. They were the ultimate survivors, cut off from family and legacy, but endlessly adapting. Byzantium teaches us one thing clearly. If you remove a man's future, he'll find a way to control the present. The funny thing about Byzantium is that its eunuchs became almost expected. Every emperor had them. Every palace hallway echoed with the shuffle of their soft shoes. And over time, they weren't just accepted. They were practically a requirement for running the empire. Take the position of Parakoimonos again, the chamberlain. For centuries, that office was almost always filled by a eunuch. Why? Because it was dangerous to let a whole man sleep next to the emperor's chamber. Too much temptation for treason. Too many chances to build his own little dynasty in the shadows. Better, the Byzantines thought, to put that kind of trust in someone who could never have heirs, who had no legacy except service. And some of them really leaned into that role. They became masters of ceremony. The ones who arranged coronations, weddings, processions. If you picture a Byzantine emperor walking down a golden hallway, flanked by guards and priests, with trumpets blaring and incense thick in the air, chances are a eunuch planned the whole thing. But there were also darker turns. Eunuchs could be weapons. More than once, a rebellious noble or rival claimant to the throne was castrated as punishment. It wasn't just mutilation. It was erasure, a way of saying, you're finished. You'll never be emperor. You'll never even be remembered as a man. Some of those victims faded into monasteries, living out quiet, bitter lives. Others, and here's the twist, bounced back, carving out influence as church leaders or imperial advisors. Byzantium loved irony like that. Chroniclers often mocked eunuchs for being sneaky, conniving, half-men. But at the same time, they admitted that the empire couldn't run without them. They were too useful, too close to power, too good at slipping into the cracks between families and factions. So the Byzantine eunuch was both despised and indispensable, mocked yet feared, set apart yet always at the emperor's side. A reminder that sometimes the people history calls weak are the ones who learn to survive the longest. So, if you were a eunuch in Byzantium, life could take some very different turns. On one hand, you might end up as a glorified butler, arranging curtains and handing the emperor his slippers. On the other, you could end up running the empire while the emperor sulked in his chambers or played with theological debates. One of the more famous figures was Joseph Bringas. He started off small, just another court eunuch serving in the Middle Byzantine period. But he had a talent for politics, the kind of quiet patience that most hot-blooded generals never managed. Eventually, Bringas became the Parakoimonos, the keeper of the imperial chamber, which meant he was basically glued to Emperor Romanos II. When Romanos died young, because of course he did, Byzantium loved nothing more than emperors dying unexpectedly. Bringas suddenly found himself holding the threads of power. The empress, Theophano, was a beautiful and ambitious woman, and Bringas became her partner in crime, running the government while pretending it was all smooth and orderly. Spoiler, it wasn't. The generals hated him, the senators whispered, and eventually, the great general Nikephoros Phocas stormed into Constantinople, pushed Bringas out, and married Theophano himself. Classic Byzantine shuffle. But the pattern kept repeating. Eunuchs like Bringas, or Basil Lecapinos, another powerful figure, managed to build these enormous networks of loyalty. They couldn't inherit a throne, but they could outmaneuver people who did. And because they had no sons, they poured their resources into monasteries, churches, and elaborate gifts for the crown. It made them look pious, generous, untouchable. And then there was the church. The Byzantine Orthodox world wasn't sure what to do with you. Some monks thought they were living martyrs, proof that earthly desires could be cut away. Others thought they were suspicious, unnatural, maybe too close to sin. Yet, over and over, eunuchs became patriarchs, bishops, abbots. They preached sermons in Hagia Sophia, their voices echoing under the Great Dome, reminding everyone that God's ways were mysterious, and sometimes a little surgical. So, whether in silk-draped halls or in sense-filled churches, eunuchs carved out a permanent role in Byzantine life. They weren't going anywhere. And honestly, by the time the empire was wobbling toward its final collapse, it was hard to imagine a Byzantium without them. By the late Byzantine centuries, the empire was a shadow of its former self. The armies were shrinking, the treasury always empty, and Constantinople itself slowly fraying at the edges. And yet, the eunuchs were still there, gliding through the corridors of the crumbling palace like ghosts who refused to leave. Even when the emperor barely controlled the city walls, eunuchs still held the keys to his chambers, still managed the scraps of court ceremony. They became keepers of memory, in a way, when everything else was falling apart. The provinces gone, the fleets destroyed, the palace rituals continued, because the eunuchs made sure they did. The crown still glittered, the incense still burned, and the emperor, half forgotten by Europe and ignored by Asia, still processed through the halls in golden robes. While eunuchs arranged the order of candles, it was almost tragic, really. These men had given up their chance at families, at ordinary lives, to bind themselves to an institution that was dying. But they clung to it anyway. For them, Byzantium wasn't just a job. It was their only identity. Without it, they were nothing. And then came 1453. The Ottoman armies surrounded Constantinople. Cannons thundered, walls crumbled, and the final emperor, Constantine XI, prepared for the end. Accounts say that even in those last desperate days, eunuchs were at their posts. They helped with logistics. They carried messages. They prayed in Hagia Sophia beside soldiers and priests, their voices rising in the dark, knowing it was all about to collapse. When the city finally fell, some eunuchs were killed in the chaos. Others were swept into Ottoman service. The empire that had once defined them was gone, but their strange, liminal role, not quite insiders, not quite outsiders, would live on in a new court, under new masters. And so, just as Constantinople shifted into Istanbul, the eunuchs shifted too. They simply traded one palace for another. The empire changed flags, but their job description didn't. The Ottomans inherited more than just the Byzantine capital. They inherited the palace model, the rituals, even the idea that eunuchs were essential for keeping emperors, now sultans, safe and surrounded. But of course, the Ottomans did things their own way. Bigger, stranger, and often more elaborate. At the center of it all was the Topkapi Palace, a sprawling maze of courtyards, gardens, and tiled chambers perched above the Bosporus, and tucked deep within that palace, behind doors most people never even glimpsed, was the harem. Now, the harem wasn't just a playground of women, despite how European travelers liked to imagine it. It was a political institution. The Sultan's wives, concubines, daughters, and mothers all lived there, and the only men allowed inside were eunuchs, which meant, once again, that eunuchs became the quiet gatekeepers of absolute power. The Ottomans divided them into two groups, the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white eunuchs usually came from Christian backgrounds, boys taken from the Balkans, Italy, or the Caucasus. They were castrated, trained, and placed in the outer palace. They ran schools, supervised pages, kept the machinery of the imperial household turning. The black eunuchs, on the other hand, came mostly from Africa. They were castrated at a much younger age, often brutally, and brought through the Red Sea trade. They served inside the harem itself, protecting the Sultan's women, which meant they weren't just servants. They were the invisible wall between the outside world and the very heart of Ottoman dynastic power. The most famous position of all was the Kisla Akask, the chief black eunuch. Don't let the title fool you. This man could be more powerful than viziers, generals, even princes. He controlled access to the harem. He relayed the sultan's orders, and he often acted as an intermediary between the royal women and the outside government. In a system where politics often hinged on whispers from behind a curtain, the eunuch who carried those whispers had enormous influence. So while Europe imagined the harem as some kind of exotic daydream, the reality was more like a chessboard, and the black eunuchs, they were the players moving the pieces. Life in the Ottoman harem was wrapped in curtains, secrecy, and ceremony. Outsiders weren't supposed to know what went on behind those carved doors. But one thing was clear: the women of the harem held extraordinary influence. Mothers of sultans, favorite concubines, and ambitious daughters all played their parts. And who stood between them and the world? The eunuchs. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Akask, wasn't just guarding doors. He was managing an empire within an empire. He oversaw hundreds of women, dozens of servants, endless streams of gifts, jewels, and silks. He organized education for the young princes. He watched over the sultan's concubines, who were themselves carefully ranked and monitored. And he controlled every slip of paper, every murmur, every secret that passed between the harem and the viziers outside. Some of these eunuchs became legends in their own right. One was Hachi Baziraka, who served in the early 18th century. He was a master networker, funding mosques, endowing schools, building fountains, and caravanserais across the empire. His name ended up carved into stone in places most people never even connected with Topkapi. But back in the palace, he was feared and respected, the kind of man who could make or break political careers with a quiet nod. And here's the strange twist. In a patriarchal empire built on dynastic bloodlines, many of the most powerful figures weren't whole men at all. They were because by removing them from the game of marriage and heirs, the Ottomans made them into perfect servants, and in doing so, created a class of officials who could outlast viziers, grand admirals, even princes. Of course, not every eunuch rose to glory. For every Basir Akka, there were dozens of others who lived and died as silent doormen, candle holders, letter carriers. They lived in small quarters, ate modestly, and vanished from memory without even a headstone to mark them. But the system always needed them. Without eunuchs, the harem simply didn't function. So, by the 17th and 18th centuries, black eunuchs weren't just servants of the sultan. They were kingmakers, or rather, sultan makers. So, picture the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's rich, vast, and intimidating. The sultans are supposed to be warrior kings, but increasingly, they're also pampered palace princes who grew up behind harem walls. And when those princes took the throne, often unsure of themselves, who stepped in to guide them? Their mothers. This period is now called the Sultanate of Women. Not officially, of course, but by later historians who realized just how much the royal women were pulling the strings. Figures like Kaiksum Sultan or Harem Sultan, better known in the West as Roxolana, essentially quarreled with their sons and husbands. They dealt in diplomacy, patronage, even assassinations. But here's the thing, those women weren't walking into council chambers themselves. They couldn't sit at a divan meeting with viziers. Instead, they worked through go-betweens, and the most reliable go-betweens were the black eunuchs. Imagine the chief black eunuch, the Kislar Akask, shuffling through palace halls with a letter tucked in his robe. That letter might be from the Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, ordering the dismissal of a vizier. Or it might be instructions for which son should inherit the throne. The eunuch carried it without question, delivered it without fail, and in the process, became the living channel between the women's quarters and the machinery of empire. It wasn't just logistics. Many of these eunuchs formed genuine alliances with the Valid Sultans. They were trusted confidants, partners in strategy. Together, they built webs of power that reached from Istanbul to Cairo, Mecca, and beyond. If the Grand Vizier thought he was running the empire, he might be in for a rude awakening, because more often than not, Real influence flowed through the harem, and the eunuchs were the ones holding the keys. And here is the irony. The men who were supposed to be the least threatening, castrated, marginalized, safe, ended up as the most dangerous gatekeepers in the Ottoman world. They outlasted sultans, viziers, and generals. Because no matter who sat on the throne, the palace doors still needed guarding. One of the most fascinating alliances was between Kaksim Sultan and her eunuchs. Kaksim, the Greek-born concubine, who became the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, understood better than anyone that power wasn't about titles. It was about access, and eunuchs controlled access. She treated them not as disposable servants, but as partners. Through them, she communicated with viziers, monitored rivals, and even arranged assassinations. When she wanted a troublesome prince removed, the order didn't come with a royal seal. It often came whispered through a eunuch's lips. They were her shadow messengers, her safety net. And because Kaksim ruled through several reigns, her eunuch network lasted decades. Then there's Harem Sultan, or Roxolana, the famous wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Her story is often told like a romance. The slave girl who became empress, but behind the silken poetry was cold strategy, and who helped her pull it off? Eunuchs. They smuggled her letters, arranged her audiences, and guarded her chambers when jealous rivals wanted her out of the way. Even the princes, those fragile heirs raised in gilded cages, leaned on eunuchs. Some were raised almost entirely by them, since their mothers couldn't accompany them into the cage's caves, where heirs were kept under house arrest. Imagine growing up surrounded only by silent guards and a few eunuchs, waiting to see if you'd be crowned sultan or quietly strangled with a bowstring. Your first father figure might not be a warrior general, but a palace eunuch who told you when to eat, when to pray, when to sleep. And the eunuchs themselves, they knew all this. They knew they were shaping sultans from childhood, whispering into their ears at the most impressionable ages. They couldn't build dynasties of blood, but they built dynasties of influence, stretching across reign after reign. So by the height of the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs weren't just fixtures of palace life. They were invisible architects of power, always present, always underestimated, and somehow always surviving. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the chief black eunuch, the Kisler-Akosk, wasn't just a palace figure. He was an empire-wide player. His authority stretched far beyond the gilded gates of Topkapi. One of his main duties was control over the wax, the religious endowments that funded mosques, schools, fountains, caravanserais, and soup kitchens across the Ottoman world. That might sound dry, but in practice, it meant handling enormous amounts of money and property. Imagine a single eunuch deciding which town gets a new mosque, which village has its water system repaired, or which scholar gets funded to teach in Cairo. That was power with a capital P. And because the empire saw the eunuchs as safe, unable to pass wealth to sons, they trusted them to manage these fortunes. The irony, of course, is that eunuchs still built legacies. Instead of heirs, they left monuments. Their names are carved into fountains that still trickle in Istanbul, into mosques that still rise in Anatolia, into schools that shaped generations. In a way, their families were stone and water rather than flesh and blood. But this golden age couldn't last forever. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was changing fast. Western ideas, bureaucratic reforms, and modern armies began to chip away at the old palace system. Eunuchs, once indispensable, started to look like relics. European visitors wrote about them with a mix of fascination and ridicule, whispering about the strange black guardians of the harem, as if they were exotic curiosities. Inside the empire, reformers began to see them as symbols of decay. The harem itself, once the center of dynastic strategy, was increasingly criticized as wasteful and outdated. And when the harem lost its grip on politics, the eunuchs who guarded it lost their purpose too. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the chief black eunuch still existed, but his power was a shadow of what it had been. Once, he could make or break viziers. Now, he was mostly a ceremonial figure, a reminder of a system that the modernizers wanted to sweep away. And yet, even as their official roles dwindled, the memory of their power lingered. For centuries, eunuchs had been the hidden gears of an empire, and when people remembered the grandeur of the Ottoman court, the black eunuchs were always part of the picture, gliding silently through marble corridors, carrying secrets that never made it into the history books. By the 19th century, Topkapi itself was fading. The sultans had largely moved into Dolmabahce Palace, a massive waterfront residence built in European Baroque style. Marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, gilded ceilings. It looked more like Versailles than a fortress. And with that move, the old rhythms of the harem and its eunuchs began to feel outdated. The chief black eunuch still had an office. He still walked in long, slow processions behind the valid sultan or stood at the threshold of the harem gates. But his voice no longer carried the same weight in the empire's politics. Ministries, embassies, newspapers, and parliaments were becoming the new channels of power. A eunuch couldn't block reformist decrees with a raised eyebrow anymore. European observers noticed the decline. Where travelers in the 17th century had written in half-fearful awe about the eunuchs' mysterious control, by the 19th they described them as pitiful, even laughable. Gaunt old men in silk robes clinging to titles that didn't mean much outside palace walls. Orientalist writers turned them into symbols of decadence, using their presence as proof that the Ottoman world was out of step with modern Europe. Inside the empire, reformers were harsher. Some described the eunuchs as parasites, lingering shadows of a feudal past. When Sultan Abdul-Majid I introduced the Tanzimat reforms, those sweeping attempts to modernize law, military, and education, the harem system itself began to shrink. And with it, the role of eunuchs shriveled too. By the time the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after World War I, eunuchs were little more than ceremonial staff. A few still lived in the palace when the Republic of Turkey was declared in 1923, but they were relics, not power brokers. One memoir even mentions elderly eunuchs wandering the abandoned harem courtyards, remembering the days when they had been indispensable. Their long history ended not with a dramatic abolition, but with a quiet fading out. The way night slips into morning. No executions, no rebellions, just irrelevance. A system that had lasted over 1,000 years in Byzantine and Ottoman courts simply evaporated with modernity. And yet, their fingerprints are still there. In the mosques they funded, the fountains they built, the dynasties they guarded, and the strange fascination they still spark in historians today. If the Byzantine and Ottoman eunuchs were shadows behind the throne, the Chinese eunuchs were something more dramatic. They were often the throne's puppeteers. And unlike in Istanbul, where black eunuchs mostly guarded the women's quarters, in Beijing, the eunuchs ended up running almost everything inside the palace. It started early. As far back as the Han Dynasty, emperors were keeping eunuchs around as trusted servants. The logic was familiar. If a man has no sons, he has no family to build rivalries with. But in practice, those harmless men had one advantage nobody else did. They lived in the emperor's shadow. Day and night, they saw him when ministers didn't. They whispered in his ear when generals were far away. By the Ming Dynasty, the system had exploded. The Forbidden City, with its endless courtyards, red walls, and golden roofs, was practically swarming with eunuchs. At its peak, there may have been 70,000 of them. 70,000. Entire districts of the palace were managed by eunuch staff. From the kitchens to the stables, from the treasury to the emperor's personal workshops. And then there was the infamous Directorate of Eunuchs, a full government office that reported directly to the emperor. These weren't just doorkeepers. They controlled budgets, managed secret police, even led military campaigns. Ministers hated it. Imagine being a Confucian scholar who spent decades memorizing classics, only to be outranked by a castrated servant who slept near the throne. But for the emperors, it made sense. Eunuchs were loyal to them, not to scholarly cliques. Of course, that much power went to their heads. Chinese history books are full of tales about evil eunuchs, corrupt, greedy, scheming figures who drained the treasury and ruined dynasties. Some of those accounts are exaggerated, written by Confucian historians who hated them on principle. But others were, let's just say, not entirely untrue. When you give a palace servant control of armies and gold, don't be surprised if he starts thinking like an emperor. And unlike their Ottoman counterparts, Chinese eunuchs didn't just fade into whispers. They left names, some dreaded, some admired, carved into the timeline of dynasties. Life as a regular eunuch in the Forbidden City wasn't glamorous. In fact, it could be crushingly routine. Most eunuchs never rose to power. They scrubbed floors, polished bronze vessels, or stood for hours holding lanterns in palace corridors. Imagine being one of 70,000, your entire world contained within the red walls. Your future entirely dependent on the whims of superiors. They lived in tiny communal quarters, often cold in the Beijing winters, damp in the summers. Food was rationed, clothing was plain, and mistakes could be punished harshly. Some were whipped for breaking protocol. Others were expelled from the palace entirely, a terrifying fate, since most eunuchs had no families to return to and nowhere to belong outside the palace gates. And yet, even in these lower ranks, there was one strange advantage: proximity. A eunuch who carried tea into the emperor's chamber or attended a princess's table could, in theory, catch someone's attention. If he pleased the right superior or showed the right loyalty at the right moment, he might be promoted. So the palace was full of quiet ambition, silent men waiting for their chance, rehearsing bows, memorizing rituals, all for the slim possibility of rising one step higher. There were also spiritual consolations. Some eunuchs became devout Buddhists, clinging to temple rituals within the palace walls. Others spent their meager earnings funding small shrines or donating to monasteries. Without families, religion sometimes became their anchor, their way of leaving a mark in a world that otherwise might forget them. But for most, the Forbidden City was a life sentence of invisibility. Their names were never recorded. They lived, served, and died in silence. When historians wrote of eunuchs ruining dynasties, they weren't thinking of these men, the endless majority who never tasted power. Still, among that sea of anonymity, a few figures did rise, some through cunning, others through sheer luck. And once they did, their influence could dwarf that of ministers, generals, even princes. Wei Zhongshan wasn't supposed to matter. Born poor in the late Ming dynasty, he started out as just another ordinary eunuch, nameless, low-ranking, invisible. But he had two things going for him: ambition and the uncanny ability to attach himself to the right people. That person turned out to be Madame K, the nurse of the young Tianqi emperor. Now, the Tianqi emperor wasn't exactly a hands-on ruler. He was more interested in carpentry than governing. He could spend hours tinkering with wood, building miniature palaces and furniture, while the actual empire slid into corruption and chaos. Which meant, of course, that someone else had to step in and run things. Enter Wei Zhongshan. Through his alliance with Madame K, he gained constant access to the emperor. And once inside that circle, he began consolidating power like a pro. Ministers who opposed him found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed. Loyal allies were promoted beyond their competence. Pretty soon, Wei Zhongshan wasn't just a palace servant. He was the de facto ruler of the empire. Historians accused him of everything: selling offices, draining the treasury, persecuting the Confucian scholars of the Donglin movement, even commissioning temples in his own honor. Yes, you heard that right, temples to himself, where people were expected to burn incense and bow. That level of ego doesn't usually end well, but while Confucian historians painted him as the devil incarnate, the truth is a little more nuanced. Wei Zhongshan didn't invent Ming corruption. He just rode the wave. Eunuchs had been rising and falling for centuries. He just happened to seize his moment with spectacular audacity. When the Tianqi emperor died in 1627, the whole house of cards collapsed. The new emperor, less interested in carpentry and more in cleaning house, ordered Wei to be arrested. Rather than face trial, Wei hanged himself. His temples were torn down, his name cursed in history books. His memory held up as the perfect warning. Give eunuchs too much power, and dynasties crumble. Of course, that's a little unfair. Dynasties crumble for lots of reasons. Corruption, weak rulers, foreign invasions. But in China, eunuchs became the convenient scapegoats. If things went wrong, blame the eunuchs. And Wei Zhanxian made that story just too easy. If you ask Confucian historians why the Ming dynasty collapsed, they'll happily wag their fingers at eunuchs. It's almost like a reflex. The empire falls, must have been the eunuchs. Taxes missing, eunuchs. Floods and famine. You guessed it, those sneaky eunuchs again. Now, to be fair, the Ming emperors did rely heavily on them. Eunuchs were perfect tools for rulers who didn't fully trust their bureaucrats. The civil service exams churned out scholars who worshipped the classics, quoted Confucius at every meeting, and tended to resist arbitrary imperial whims. Eunuchs, on the other hand, had no independent power base outside the palace. They couldn't pass on titles to sons, couldn't build rival clans, couldn't march an army without the emperor's permission. They were, at least in theory, loyal only to the throne. In practice, well, loyalty is flexible when bribes are involved. Many eunuchs became middlemen for corruption. Want an official post, slipped some silver into the eunuch's hands, and suddenly the emperor just happened to hear your name. Wants your rival ruined. Same process, just with a slightly larger bribe. And because eunuchs lived in the palace, breathing the same air as the ruler, they had an edge over scholars who lived far away. The emperor might see his chief minister once a day, maybe less, but the eunuchs, they were everywhere, holding candles, pouring tea, fanning his face in summer, guarding his private chambers. That's constant access. And in politics, access is everything. Of course, access also meant scapegoating. When an emperor died young, people muttered about poisoned medicine prepared by eunuchs. When the treasury was empty, they whispered about eunuchs hoarding silver in secret vaults. When scholars were flogged in court, eunuchs were accused of orchestrating it from behind the scenes. By the time the Ming dynasty finally collapsed in 1644, the evil eunuch trope was fully cemented. Even the next dynasty, the Qing, kept repeating the story. Look at those Ming eunuchs, ruining everything, which was a convenient way of saying, we won't make that mistake. Except, of course, they did. Because every dynasty swore they wouldn't, and then every dynasty did. So, the Ming fell apart in 1644, and the Manchu conquerors swooped in to found the Qing dynasty. And like every new dynasty before them, the Qing started with bold promises. We will not let eunuchs rule the state, they declared. We've learned from history. We're smarter than the Ming. And sure, in the early years, they meant it. The first Qing emperors kept eunuchs on very short leashes. No more running ministries, no more controlling armies. Their job was to clean, guard, and fetch. Simple, but time has a funny way of eroding rules. By the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, one of the longest ruling monarchs in Chinese history, eunuchs were back in business. They weren't dictating foreign policy, but they managed the emperor's inner court, the imperial workshops, the palace archives, and the all-important treasure vaults. If you wanted to know where the emperor was, or what he planned to do tomorrow, a eunuch probably knew before the ministers did. Fast forward to the Qianlong Emperor, the guy who loved poetry, art, and also somehow bankrupted the empire with too many vanity projects. By his later years, eunuchs had wormed their way back into influence. And yes, the corruption stories resurfaced. Bribes, favoritism, hoarded wealth. The classics never go out of style. But here's the twist. Qing eunuchs lived in the shadow of a dynasty that was already struggling with something bigger than court intrigue. Foreign invasions, economic crises, the Opium Wars. Those were problems eunuchs couldn't exactly solve or cause. But they still made excellent scapegoats. Whenever things went wrong, conservative voices muttered, "Ah, It must be the eunuchs again. By the late 19th century, during the twilight of the Qing, eunuchs were once again symbols of decline. They shuffled through the endless, echoing corridors of the Forbidden City, whispering secrets, running errands, and hoarding what little power they could. They weren't tea-toppling dynasties anymore. The British and French were doing that job quite nicely, but in the cultural imagination, eunuchs still carried the blame. And then came the final chapter. The fall of the Qing in 1911 left hundreds of eunuchs wandering aimlessly, suddenly unemployed, still dressed in outdated robes. A few tried to find work as servants. Others drifted into poverty. Some were interviewed decades later, reminiscing about the palace life that had vanished like smoke. They were living fossils, relics of a system the world had outgrown. The very last known Chinese imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, died in 1996. Yes, 1996. Which means that someone alive in the era of cassette tapes and dial-up internet still remembered the days of kowtowing before an emperor. History really isn't as far away as we like to think. Picture the Topkapi Palace in the 16th century. Marble floors, tiled walls glittering in blues and greens, fountains murmuring in hidden courtyards. At the center of this sprawling maze was the Sultan, the absolute ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world. But surrounding the Sultan was a carefully curated bubble, the harem and the inner palace, and guarding it all, eunuchs, lots of them. Now, in the Ottoman system, there were actually two distinct groups. First, the white eunuchs, often from the Balkans or Caucasus, castrated young and trained to serve in administrative roles. They were educated, polished, and often ended up in bureaucratic posts. They worked in the outer palace, managing scribes and secretaries, and acting as the Sultan's gatekeepers. Then, there were the black eunuchs, usually from East Africa, who guarded the harem itself. Their leader, the chief black eunuch, or Kisler Akask, ended up as one of the most powerful figures in the empire. Because think about it, he controlled access to the women of the harem, and by extension, to the mothers of future sultans, which meant that when palace politics swirled, the chief black eunuch was often right at the center of the storm. And palace politics in the Ottoman world could be vicious, rival mothers scheming for their sons, concubines jockeying for attention, ministers whispering about succession. The chief black eunuch was the quiet broker in all of this, delivering secret notes, arranging alliances, sometimes even tipping the scales in the deadly game of heirs. Of course, like in China, the stories grew darker with retelling. Whenever corruption was suspected, eunuchs were blamed. Whenever the harem seemed too powerful, fingers pointed at the eunuchs. But again, it wasn't really about them. It was about the fact that they were the ones closest to the throne. And in politics, closeness is dangerous. Still, the Ottomans made eunuchs more institutionalized than most. They weren't just tolerated. They were a pillar of the system. The chief black eunuch, in particular, ranked higher than almost any other court official. When he walked through the palace halls, even senior viziers would step aside. Not bad for someone history liked to dismiss as a mere servant. In theory, they were all servants of the Sultan. In practice, the palace split them into two camps that didn't always get along. The white eunuchs, drawn mostly from European boys, captured or purchased through slavery, were usually stationed in the outer court. They were literate, trained in the scribal arts, and often rose into administrative roles. Some became Kapia Kask, gatekeepers, who literally controlled the doors between the Sultan and the outside world. For generations, they had been the dominant eunuch faction, the respectable face of palace service. But then, the black eunuchs rose. Brought from Sudan, Ethiopia, and other parts of East Africa, they were placed in charge of the harem, and once they gained the Sultan's trust, their leader, the chief black eunuch, started edging out his white counterparts. After all, what's more powerful, keeping a bureaucrat waiting at the palace door, or deciding which concubine gets to spend the night with the Sultan? One controls paperwork, the other controls dynasties. By the 17th century, the balance had tipped. The black eunuchs weren't just harem guards anymore. They were power brokers. They arranged the Sultan's personal life, influenced succession, and even managed vast charitable foundations tied to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The chief black eunuch, in fact, technically oversaw Islam's most sacred sites. That's a long way from guarding a bedroom corridor. Naturally, resentment brewed. White eunuchs looked down on their black counterparts as uneducated and less refined. Black eunuchs saw the whites as jealous relics clinging to outdated roles. Their rivalry wasn't just about race or pride. It was about access. Who stood closer to the Sultan? Who got the ear of the valid Sultan, the Queen Mother? Who could tilt the balance when two princes were quietly competing for the throne? It was a tug-of-war fought in whispers, favors, and subtle gestures. And like all palace rivalries, it rarely ended with one side completely victorious. Still, by the time of the great Ottoman sultanas, women like Qasim Sultan, it was clear the black eunuchs had won the long game. The harem and its guardians were now at the heart of the empire. Imagine walking through Topkapi Palace in the 17th century. Courtyards open into more courtyards, tiled corridors, wind-toward, hidden gardens, and at almost every turn, you'll find eunuchs moving silently, half in shadow, half in authority. But outside of ceremonies and whispered orders, what was their daily life actually like? Most eunuchs lived in communal barracks within the palace. For the black eunuchs of the harem, this meant small, plain quarters just outside the private chambers of the women they guarded. The rooms were modest, sparsely furnished, sometimes with little more than a mat, a chest, and a small lamp. Privacy wasn't really the point. Life revolved around duty. Their days started early. Before dawn, they performed ablutions and prayers. Then, depending on rank, they might spend hours standing guard at doors, delivering messages, or escorting visitors through the endless maze of the palace. The higher-ranking eunuchs handled documents, gifts, and private correspondence. Always careful, always discreet. Meals were plain but steady. Bread, lentils, stews, sometimes meat on special occasions. They ate together in long rows, almost like monks in a monastery. Though the conversations must have been full of sharp whispers about who had the Sultan's favor that week. Leisure was rare, but not absent. Some eunuchs learned to read the Quran and study Arabic or Turkish poetry. Others became patrons of music, enjoying soft performances in private corners of the harem. A few, surprisingly, took up calligraphy, a way of leaving behind beauty when their own lineage could not. And there was another side. Loneliness. Cut off from family, unable to have children, their identities reshaped by palace service. Eunuchs often turned to each other for companionship. Friendships could be deep and lasting, forged in long nights, guarding the silent marble halls. Rivalries, too, were intense. A single promotion or snub could change the whole balance of the dormitory. In the evenings, when the palace quieted and lamps glowed faintly in the courtyards, eunuchs would gather in small groups. Some told stories of their homelands. Others whispered about politics they had overheard. The higher the rank, the more secrets they carried. And secrets in the Ottoman palace were as valuable as gold. It was a life of paradox, both powerful and powerless, privileged and cut off, endlessly close to the center of the empire, yet always on the edge of belonging. One of the first to really stand out was Habashi Mehmed Aga in the late 16th century. As chief black eunuch, he oversaw not only the harem, but also vast charitable endowments tied to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Think about that for a second. A man who technically had no family could still wield authority over Islam's sacred foundations. That's not just palace gossip territory. That's real religious clout. But the role only grew bigger. By the 17th century, chief black eunuchs were power brokers on a scale that startled even seasoned visitors. Take Huk Mustafa Aga, who served under Sultan Murad IV, the notoriously temperamental sultan known for banning coffee, tobacco, and alcohol, and personally executing offenders in the streets. Mustafa Aga wasn't just a servant in Murad's palace. He was a mediator, sometimes softening the blows of his master's temper, sometimes channeling them more strategically. And then came the golden age of the Ottoman queen mothers, the valid sultans. Women like Kaiksim Sultan and Turhan Sultan effectively ruled the empire when their sons were too young or too weak to manage it themselves, and who stood at their side, carrying messages, enforcing decisions, and protecting the harem from rivals. The chief black eunuch. This made him more than just a courtier. He became the bridge between the empire's most powerful woman and the sultan himself. It was a triangle of influence: the sultan, the valet, and the chief black eunuch, and often, the empire tilted depending on which side of that triangle held firm. Historians sometimes called this the Sultanate of Women, but really, it was also the Sultanate of their eunuch allies. Without them, the queen mothers couldn't have extended their power beyond the silk curtains of the harem. Of course, these eunuchs didn't all end well. Some died wealthy, their tombs still visible in Istanbul today. Others fell victim to palace purges, strangled quietly with a silk cord. A reminder that Ottoman politics was never gentle, no matter how high you rose. Still, their legacy lingers. Walk through Istanbul today, and you can find mosques, fountains, and schools built with their names attached. Quiet monuments to men history liked to pretend were voiceless. Take Kaiksim Sultan, probably the most famous of all Ottoman queen mothers. She rose from being a concubine to becoming the power behind the throne for decades. Her sons, Murad IV and Ibrahim I, weren't exactly stable material for running an empire. Murad was harsh and unpredictable. Ibrahim, well, he earned the nickname Ibrahim the Mad. So, guess who had to keep the machinery of empire from falling apart? Kaiksim. But Kaiksim didn't work alone. Standing right behind her was the chief black eunuch, her closest ally in the palace. He was the one who carried her orders into the council chamber, who shielded her from rivals, who made sure her chosen allies gained posts and her enemies conveniently vanished. If the valid sultan was the strategist, the eunuch was the executor. Their partnership was symbiotic. Kaiksim provided legitimacy. As the mother of sultans, she could claim divine sanction for her authority. The eunuch provided logistics. He knew the corridors, the guards, the rhythms of palace life. Together, they ran a quiet empire within the empire. And it wasn't just Kaiksim. Her successor, Turhan Sultan, leaned heavily on her chief black eunuch as well. When Kaiksim and Turhan clashed in the deadly struggle for influence, a struggle that ended with Kaiksim strangled in her own chambers. Eunuchs were at the heart of the conflict. Some stayed loyal to Kaiksim, others to Turhan, and in the end, the ones who bet on Turhan survived. It's easy to forget how dangerous these alliances were. For a eunuch, being the queen mother's right hand could bring immense wealth, estates, and prestige, but it could also mean being strangled the moment your patroness fell from grace. It was a high-wire act, walked in silence, in the soft shuffle of slippers across palace tiles. And yet, many eunuchs chose that path. Because in a world where they were stripped of family and lineage, power was the one inheritance they could claim. In Byzantium, eunuchs weren't just tolerated. They were practically a political class of their own. They couldn't have dynasties. They couldn't rebel with sons and heirs. And that made them oddly safe in a world obsessed with family alliances. Safe enough, in fact, that emperors often trusted them more than blood relatives. And so, you'd find eunuchs everywhere. Generals leading armies, diplomats brokering treaties, patriarchs running church councils, and chamberlains overseeing the emperor's private life. Where other cultures kept eunuchs in the shadows, Byzantium let them walk right into the sunlight of official titles. Take Basil Lecapenus, for example. He was the illegitimate son of Emperor Romanos I, castrated to keep him out of the succession game. Which sounds like a dead end. But Basil flipped it into a career move. He rose through the ranks, became Parakoimonos, the emperor's chief chamberlain, and ended up ruling the empire behind the scenes for nearly 40 years. Ministers came and went. Emperors grew old, died, or were replaced. Basil stayed. The safe eunuch outlived them all. Byzantine sources often describe eunuchs as cunning, manipulative, sometimes even sinister, which probably says more about envy than reality. These were men who navigated a treacherous court with nothing but brains, charm, and patience. They couldn't pass on lands to sons, so they invested in churches, monasteries, and artistic patronage instead. Walk through Byzantine ruins, and some of the finest mosaics still bear eunuch donors' names. And their status wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Eunuchs had their own court titles, their own hierarchies, even their own ceremonial roles in imperial rituals. They were a permanent fixture of Byzantine life, not an accident or a scandal. It's almost ironic. In the West, eunuchs were often ridiculed. In Byzantium, they were feared and respected. They weren't half men in the eyes of the court. They were a third gender of politics, occupying a space no one else could. And in a city like Constantinople, where power shifted like the tides, that strange in-between role may have been the ultimate survival trick. One of the most famous names is Narcissus, though he's better remembered in Western histories as a general in Justinian's army. Born a eunuch, he somehow rose to command forces in Italy, defeating the Ostrogoths and reclaiming territories that had been lost for decades. Imagine that, a man considered less than a man by contemporary gender norms, leading armies, signing treaties, and negotiating the fate of entire cities. But Narcissus' career wasn't all military glory. Within Constantinople, eunuchs often acted as stewards of the court, advisors, and diplomats. They could serve as personal secretaries to the emperor, handling sensitive correspondence and intelligence. In a society obsessed with lineage and family ties, eunuchs were uniquely trusted. Having no heirs meant they couldn't build rival dynasties. Basil Lecapenus, whom we mentioned before, was another masterclass in this. Castrated as a child to remove him from the line of succession, he instead carved out a 40-year career as the empire's de facto ruler behind the throne. He managed emperors, dismissed ministers, appointed bishops, and navigated the endless Byzantine factional intrigues with a patience that would exhaust most ordinary men. It's fascinating to imagine what court life looked like from their perspective. While princes and generals jostled for inheritance and prestige, eunuchs moved through corridors largely unthreatened by blood feuds. They weren't the outsiders exactly. They were insiders without families, which in the Byzantine world turned out to be the perfect combination. They could watch, listen, influence, and survive while everyone else risked everything on ambition or birthright. And they weren't invisible. Their presence was ceremonial, always visible in public ceremonies, palace rituals, and religious processions. Yet, in a way, they were ghosts too, operating behind the scenes, holding secrets that could topple ministers, shape policies, and control access to emperors. Byzantine eunuchs were paradoxical, respected, feared, and sometimes hated, yet indispensable, and they weren't just oddities of court culture. They were a fundamental part of how the empire functioned, bridging gaps between rulers, advisors, and subjects in a world where trust was a rare commodity. In the Mughal courts, eunuchs weren't just attendants, they were crucial intermediaries. The palaces of Agra, Delhi, and Lahore were vast labyrinths of corridors, chambers, and private gardens. Access to the emperor or his harem was tightly controlled, and eunuchs were the gatekeepers. They regulated audiences, delivered messages, and ensured the privacy of the royal women. But like their counterparts in Byzantium and the Ottoman Empire, some eunuchs went far beyond mere service. The most trusted eunuchs could influence succession, recommend appointments, or even advise on military campaigns. Their loyalty was a prized commodity. Without sons to inherit their power, they theoretically had no ambition outside their immediate duties. That made them the perfect confidants and the perfect instruments of palace intrigue. Take the famous eunuch, Khwaja Shamsuddin, who served under Emperor Akbar. Records suggest he was deeply involved in court administration and the management of imperial estates. Trusted enough to handle finances and correspondence, he became a quiet force in palace politics. And because he was always in the inner corridors of power, he often acted as an intermediary between the emperor and factions of courtiers or even provincial governors. Daily life for Mughal eunuchs blended ritual, routine, and constant observation. They oversaw the women's quarters, arranged ceremonies, managed gifts, and maintained records. They ate, slept, and prayed within palace walls. And like Ottoman and Byzantine eunuchs, their relationships with their masters could be deadly serious. One misstep, one failure to please, and exile, or worse, awaited. Yet, for those who navigated the treacherous waters successfully, the rewards were substantial. Wealth, influence, and sometimes the ability to shape the empire's future. Some eunuchs even commissioned buildings, gardens, and mosques in their own name, leaving behind lasting traces of their existence. Silent legacies embedded in stone and tile. The Mughal eunuchs were, in many ways, mirrors of the empires they served. Complex, hierarchical, filled with ceremony and ritual, and yet entirely dependent on human relationships, loyalty, and trust. When you step back and look at it, eunuchs in these three great empires weren't just palace oddities or exotic curiosities. They were vital instruments of power, guardians of secrets, and silent architects of dynasties. Across Istanbul, Constantinople, and Agra, a few patterns start to appear. First, access was everything. In Byzantium, they were trusted advisors and generals. In the Ottoman Empire, they controlled the harem and the queen mother. In the Mughal court, they bridged the emperor and the women's quarters. In all cases, being physically close to the center of power, the throne itself translated into influence. The more you saw, the more you knew, the more you could shape events without ever holding an official office. Second, the paradox of power and vulnerability. Eunuchs could rise to incredible heights, but they were always dependent on their patrons. Lose favor, and a eunuch could be exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Their authority was real but fragile. They were insiders without kinship, outsiders without blood ties, walking a high wire of influence where a single misstep could be fatal. Third, the legacy of invisibility. Most eunuchs never reached historical fame. The daily labor of guarding, cleaning, delivering messages, and enforcing rules went unnoticed. Only a few, like Wei Zhongxian, Basil Lekapenos, or Kaiksem sultans, chief black eunuchs, left a mark on history. But even the invisible majority shaped the rhythm of palace life, the security of rulers, and the smooth functioning of empires. Finally, their methods of immortality. With no children to inherit their wealth or power, eunuchs often turned to architecture, charity, and patronage. Mosques, fountains, schools, gardens, these became their legacies. Silent testaments to lives lived in service, ambition, and constant negotiation with fortune. And there's an irony here. Societies often ridiculed or feared eunuchs, blaming them for corruption, palace intrigue, or dynastic collapses. Yet, without them, the empire's inner workings might have unraveled far sooner. They were indispensable, precisely because they were overlooked, underestimated, and trapped in a paradoxical position of both power and limitation. So, across continents and centuries, eunuchs were more than curiosities. They were the silent gears of empires, quietly steering histories we now read about in textbooks, memoirs, and mosaics. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world that had once depended on eunuchs was changing. Empires were modernizing, bureaucracies were professionalizing, and centralized state systems began to rely less on palace servants and more on formal institutions. And with that, the role of the eunuch began to fade. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch remained a figurehead for a while, but real political power was increasingly concentrated in ministries, foreign offices, and the sultan's direct advisors. By the 19th century, when the sultans moved into Dolmabahce Palace, the harem system itself was shrinking. Eunuchs shuffled along, performing ceremonial duties, managing the inner palace, and living on stipends, shadows of their former authority. The few who survived into the early 20th century were witnesses to a vanished world, wandering silent corridors, carrying memories of a life that had ended quietly, without fanfare or revolt. In China, eunuchs lingered longest. The Ming dynasty's collapse had highlighted their potential for corruption, but the Qing emperors still used them in the Forbidden City, managing everything from archives to imperial workshops. It wasn't until the fall of the Qing in 1911 that eunuchs lost their roles entirely. The very last imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, lived until 1996. A man who had seen the end of a centuries-old system and lived into the modern age. An almost surreal bridge between worlds. In Byzantium, of course, the story had ended much earlier. By the fall of Constantinople, in 1453, eunuchs were no longer a political force. They remained in records, in mosaics, and in the echoes of palace rituals. But the empire itself vanished, taking their roles with it. The decline of eunuchs wasn't violent, for the most part. It wasn't about executions or revolts. It was about modernization. Professional armies, bureaucracies, and shifting social structures simply rendered them unnecessary. And yet, their imprint remained. Buildings they had funded, networks they had controlled, histories they had shaped from behind curtains and palace gates. It's almost poetic. Men who had lived lives of intense proximity to absolute power left history not with loud declarations, but with quiet legacies, relics, memories, and stories that continue to fascinate. Eunuchs faded, but their presence lingers, like the last candle in a palace hallway, dimly lighting a world that no longer exists. For all the power, influence, and palace intrigue, eunuchs had remarkably ordinary routines. Some rose with the first light, performing ablutions and prayers before the palace stirred. Others lingered in bed longer, delaying their duties with a whispered excuse. Because even eunuchs enjoyed the comfort of warmth on cold marble floors. Meals were often simple bread, stews, rice, or lentils. But a few high-ranking eunuchs could indulge in delicacies. Some developed particular tastes, an affection for rosewater, a fondness for spiced meats, or a ritualistic enjoyment of tea brewed exactly the same way each morning. In many ways, these small habits offered control in lives otherwise governed by the whims of emperors and queens. Hobbies were surprisingly common. Some eunuchs became accomplished calligraphers, scribbling poetry or copying religious texts. Others cultivated gardens, tending fragrant herbs or flowers within palace courtyards. Music was another refuge. Eunuchs sometimes learned to play instruments or sing softly during the evening hours, filling silent corridors with notes that only a few could hear. And then there were the oddities, the little eccentricities that humanized them. Some, in China, were obsessed with small tokens of luck, jade figurines, lucky coins, or carefully folded paper charms. Ottoman eunuchs might have collected tiny trinkets or manuscripts, carefully cataloging them in secret rooms. Byzantine eunuchs were known, occasionally, for meticulously arranging the emperor's personal items, almost obsessively, because the order of objects could mean order in the mind. Friendships and alliances within eunuch communities were critical. Without families of their own, they formed bonds that were almost familial. They whispered secrets, shared stories of childhoods long ago, and consoled one another in moments of loneliness. Rivalries existed, of course, but in a world of isolation, companionship became survival. And in the quiet hours, when lanterns glowed softly and the palace seemed to breathe around them, eunuchs often reflected on the strangeness of their lives, close to the most powerful people in the world, yet cut off from legacy. Powerful enough to influence empires, yet invisible in most histories. Alive to every secret, yet unable to fully claim their own story. In a way, their lives were a constant balancing act. A mixture of ceremony, duty, and subtle rebellion, lived quietly behind palace walls, in corridors where whispers carried more weight than swords. Even the most powerful eunuchs had odd little routines, Some, especially in the Ottoman harem, reportedly developed a fascination with perfumes. They would carry tiny vials of rose, amber, or musk, sniffing discreetly throughout the day. Imagine a powerful man, orchestrating palace politics, pausing to dab a hint of fragrance on his robe. A tiny assertion of control, an identity in a life otherwise dictated by protocol. Others had peculiar sleeping habits. Chinese eunuchs often slept in shifts, because the Forbidden City never truly slept. Guards, messengers, and servants rotated constantly. A eunuch might nap lightly, with one ear tuned to the faintest whisper, ready to wake if the emperor or a prince required him. Some even trained themselves to sleep in sitting positions. Awkward, uncomfortable, but practical for a life spent on alert. Food rituals were another form of quiet rebellion or comfort. A eunuch might insist on a particular spoon or bowl, arrange spices in precise order, or insist that tea be brewed exactly 3 times before it could be served. To outsiders, it may have seemed obsessive or trivial. To them, it was order in a chaotic, unpredictable existence. There were also little competitions among eunuchs. Who could memorize the emperor's schedule fastest? Who could recall every gift, message, and command without error? Small contests, whispered between friends, sharpened skills, and provided subtle entertainment in an otherwise rigid life. And humor, dry, soft, and private, was essential. Stories of eunuchs quietly mocking pompous ministers or whispering ironic asides about court ceremonies survive in letters and chronicles. Their jokes were never public. They were whispered in corridors, a private rebellion against the relentless seriousness of palace life. Even in moments of luxury, there was irony. Some high-ranking eunuchs amassed wealth, estates, and servants, yet had no children to inherit them. They built gardens, fountains, and small shrines, monuments to themselves that could outlast their lives. In a world where legacy mattered most, they had to invent it in bricks, stone, and paper. It's these small, human details that make their lives linger in memory. Powerful, invisible, and often trapped in paradox, eunuchs navigated the corridors of empires with patience, cunning, and subtle humor, quietly shaping history while living almost entirely out of view. One of the quietly ironic things about eunuchs is that they were often the closest witnesses to the private lives of rulers. Yet they themselves were excluded from the very family life that shaped the rest of society. They saw births, weddings, coronations, and funerals, but had none of their own. In the Mughal harem, a eunuch might cradle an infant prince for the first time, memorizing every detail, while knowing he could never father a child himself. In Byzantium, eunuchs were present at imperial banquets, observing the lineage of emperors and generals. But their own names would rarely appear in family trees. Some adapted by developing intense personal rituals, daily prayers, careful grooming, meticulous records, and even miniature collections of artwork or calligraphy became ways to assert their individuality in a life otherwise defined by service. These were quiet forms of control, almost meditative, arranging a garden, folding a piece of paper into an exact shape, or aligning lamps in precise order. In a way, the smallest acts gave them a sense of permanence that the empire might not. There's also the social aspect. Eunuchs, especially in the Ottoman and Mughal courts, often formed communities within the palace. Friendships, mentorships, and alliances were essential, a source of comfort, information, and occasional mischief. In Constantinople, eunuchs shared whispers about rivalries and schemes. In Beijing, they passed small tokens, lucky charms, and even coded notes. Humor and camaraderie allowed them to survive a life of extreme isolation, creating microcosms of society within palace walls. And then there's ambition, subtle, patient, and strategic. Some eunuchs, like Basil Lycopenos in Byzantium or Wei Zhongxian in China, maneuvered themselves into positions of extraordinary influence. They could appoint ministers, advise emperors, and shape dynastic policy. all while remaining formally outside the political hierarchy. Their lives were paradoxical, invisible yet powerful, dependent yet indispensable, isolated yet intimately involved in history's most important moments. Finally, there was the irony of legacy. Lacking children, many invested in architecture, religious foundations, gardens, or scholarly works. These were quiet monuments to themselves, visible to all, but tied to no bloodline. Centuries later, historians, storytellers, and archaeologists would find traces of these lives and realize how central eunuchs had been to palace politics, culture, and ritual. In a sense, their lives were a meditation on power, proximity, and a human need for identity, lived quietly, invisibly, and with an almost ironic grace. Some eunuchs had peculiar routines that almost resembled meditative exercises. In China, a eunuch might spend hours carefully arranging inkstones, brushes, and scrolls on a desk, repeating the same sequence each morning. Ottoman eunuchs sometimes polished palace lamps or straightened ceremonial robes in near ritualistic precision. These small, repetitive acts weren't just about neatness. There were ways of asserting control in a life governed by others' whims. Sleeping habits were another fascinating detail. Many eunuchs developed the ability to sleep lightly, almost sitting up, so they could respond instantly to an emperor's summons. In the Forbidden City or Topkapi Palace, no corridor was ever truly silent, and every footstep could signal duty or danger. Light, alert, sleep became a skill, honed over decades. Food, too, offered quiet moments of ritual and personality. Some eunuchs insisted on very particular arrangements. Their tea brewed in a specific order, spices aligned meticulously, or meals taken at precise times. These small preferences became both comfort and subtle rebellion, acclaimed a personal order within vast, impersonal palaces. Humor, whispered in corridors, was essential. Soft, dry, private jokes about pompous ministers, ceremonial excess, or the eccentricities of princes and emperors, kept spirits alive. These jokes were never recorded for public consumption. They existed only in the fleeting bonds of trust among peers. Friendships formed another lifeline. Without families, eunuchs relied on one another for companionship, support, and occasional counsel. Alliances were practical, of course, but also human. Shared stories of childhoods long lost, quiet confidences, and small acts of generosity created a private society within the palace walls. And yet, for all their routine, ritual, and camaraderie, eunuchs were constantly aware of their paradox, close to absolute power, but unable to claim lineage, indispensable, yet often scapegoated, observers of history, yet largely invisible in its pages. Perhaps that very tension shaped the unique grace, discipline, and subtle cunning that defined their lives. Their existence was a meditation on identity, influence, and survival, lived quietly, intimately intertwined with the greatest empires in history, yet always on the edges, quietly shaping events that would outlive them. In Beijing, some eunuchs were obsessed with small charms or tokens, jade pieces, carved ivory, or carefully folded paper amulets. These objects were more than decoration. They were talismans against misfortune, tiny reminders of identity in a life largely dictated by others. They carried these in pockets, hidden drawers, or on strings around their necks, offering comfort in the endless monotony of palace corridors. In Constantinople, eunuchs sometimes adopted unusual hobbies to pass the hours. Some became amateur historians, recording court events in meticulous detail, aware that their unique perspective on power might be invaluable one day. Others dabbled in music, teaching themselves instruments in private rooms, filling empty halls with faint melodies that only a few could hear. These small acts of creation gave them a sense of life beyond duty. Ottoman eunuchs, too, had quiet, almost ritualistic pleasures. Some kept tiny gardens within the palace, tending flowers, herbs, or fruit trees in carefully maintained plots. Others collected small manuscripts or coins, cataloging them obsessively. Each act was a subtle claim to permanence in a life designed to leave no trace beyond service. Even their social interactions were layered with subtlety. Friendships were critical. Rivalries, unavoidable. Whispers carried intelligence, gossip, or warnings. In the Mughal court, a eunuch might act as a messenger between factions, building networks of trust and influence that quietly shaped imperial decisions. Humor and camaraderie offered relief from isolation, while rivalries sharpened skills and kept one vigilant in the ever-shifting corridors of power. And yet, despite these small pleasures, there was always awareness of impermanence. Empires changed, rulers died, and the roles that defined eunuchs' lives could vanish overnight. They learned to navigate this instability with patience, observation, and subtlety, traits that historians often note, but rarely capture the lived experience of daily life in a palace. The beauty of these anecdotes is that they reveal eunuchs not just as political instruments, but as human beings, adapting, surviving, finding small joys, creating private worlds, and leaving traces, sometimes literal, sometimes anecdotal, for future generations to discover. In the Mughal courts, some eunuchs developed elaborate personal rituals to mark the passing of days. One might rise before dawn to recite prayers while polishing ceremonial weapons or palace ornaments. Another might spend hours aligning inkpots and brushes with almost obsessive precision, a quiet meditation before delivering messages or guarding the inner harem. These small acts offered control and a sense of order in a life defined by the schedules of emperors, queens, and ministers. Eunuchs often developed intricate systems of memorization. In Constantinople, some memorized every guest, every gift, every corridor twist in the palace, an indispensable skill when mediating between factions or ensuring the smooth functioning of imperial ceremonies. In Topkapi, Ottoman eunuchs kept mental maps of the harem, knowing who slept where, who had influence, and which alliances were rising or falling. Knowledge, after all, was power, and in their peculiar liminal position, it was the closest thing they had to security. Humor and storytelling were quiet lifelines, whispers about minor scandals, absurdities of protocol, or the eccentricities of princes and emperors circulated among eunuchs. These stories were private, fleeting, often irreverent, a soft counterpoint to the rigid formality of palace life. And while historians rarely recorded them, they formed the social glue that kept eunuchs connected to one another in the midst of isolation. Food, too, was ritualized. Tea, sweets, or small delicacies could become mini ceremonies with strict preparation methods, precise timings, and subtle preferences. Eating became a moment of personal assertion, a small way to mark identity within an environment designed to suppress individuality. And above all, there was companionship. Eunuchs formed deep bonds with each other, mentoring newcomers, exchanging advice, or simply sharing stories of lost childhoods and homelands. In a world without family, these networks were essential for survival, emotional, social, and even political. Through all these small details, eunuchs revealed the paradox of their existence, intimately involved in the highest reaches of power, yet profoundly cut off from the human experiences of legacy and lineage. Their lives were a constant negotiation between duty, survival, and subtle assertion of self. Quiet, patient, and endlessly fascinating. In the Ottoman Empire, some eunuchs became quietly superstitious. Small charms, amulets, or arranged trinkets were placed in hidden drawers or tucked into robes. A perfectly aligned row of coins on a table or a small carved figure on a shelf might seem trivial. Yet these were subtle assertions of order, luck, and identity in a life otherwise shaped entirely by the palace's routines. In the Mughal courts, a eunuch might develop precise timings for every task, the order of delivering messages, arranging garments, or lighting lamps at dusk. Deviating from the ritual could feel like inviting chaos, not just into one's day, but into the smooth functioning of the court itself. In a world where the emperor's temper or the harem's politics could change in an instant, these little rituals provided stability and reassurance. Food and drink, too, offered small comforts. Eunuchs often had favorite flavors, preferred cooking methods, or ceremonial ways to enjoy tea and sweets. Some measured every spice, others brewed tea exactly 3 times before it could be served. These acts may have seemed obsessive to outsiders, but they were deeply personal forms of self-expression and control. Humor remained a quiet lifeline. In corridors filled with whispers, eunuchs would exchange soft, dry jokes about pompous ministers, absurd ceremonies, or the quirks of princes. These jokes were never loud or public, just brief sparks of levity and lives defined by vigilance and discretion. Friendship and mentorship were critical. Eunuchs relied on one another for guidance, companionship, and survival strategies. Stories of lost childhoods, distant homelands, or past adventures were shared in whispered confidences. Rivalries existed, of course, but bonds forged in isolation were often strong and enduring, offering emotional sustenance in the midst of palace monotony. Even in quiet moments, eunuchs exercised subtle influence. A suggestion here, a minor intervention there. A carefully delivered message. Small actions rippled through palace politics. They were both observers and participants, quietly shaping the rhythms of power, while performing a life largely invisible to outsiders. In this way, their existence was both paradoxical and fascinating, intimately involved in history's most powerful moments, yet largely hidden, constrained, and forced to find meaning in the small, quiet details of everyday life. In the Mughal palaces, some eunuchs became quietly obsessive about order. Lamps were aligned, rugs smoothed, utensils placed just so, not out of vanity, but as a subtle assertion of control in a life dictated by others. When the emperor woke, these small acts of precision ensured that the palace could function smoothly and that the eunuch could move through his day with a sense of purpose and calm. Even simple tasks took on ritualistic significance. Arranging scrolls, cleaning small artifacts, or cataloging gifts became exercises in focus and patience. These habits weren't merely about neatness. They were a kind of meditation, a way of marking time and carving out personal space within a regimented world. Tea and food rituals were another quiet source of comfort. Some eunuchs brewed tea in exact sequences, measured spices meticulously, or prepared simple dishes with careful attention to timing and presentation. These acts allowed them to claim a tiny island of autonomy, a private joy that the palace's hierarchy couldn't touch. Friendships, mentorships, and alliances were lifelines. In the silence of corridors and inner chambers, eunuchs shared stories, advice, and small confidences. Rivalries existed, naturally, but the bonds forged in isolation were often strong, providing emotional sustenance in an otherwise constraining environment. Humor remained subtle but persistent. Whispered jokes about ceremonies, ministers, or minor court absurdities kept morale alive. Some eunuchs also turned to artistic or intellectual pursuits. Calligraphy, miniature painting, music, and poetry offered creative outlets and a chance to leave behind traces of themselves. Architecture, gardens, or charitable donations became more lasting markers, a kind of immortality in stone, water, and paper. And even in their highest moments of influence, eunuchs understood the paradox of their lives. They could shape empires, advise emperors, and protect royal secrets. Yet their existence remained fundamentally constrained. Power was theirs to wield, but personal legacy, family, and public recognition were mostly out of reach. In these quiet, detailed acts, rituals, friendships, humor, and subtle influence, eunuchs carved out meaningful lives within the rigid structures of empire. Their existence reminds us that history isn't only about battles and crowns, but also about those who shape it quietly, invisibly, and patiently. In the corridors where power lives, in the Ottoman harem, some eunuchs developed a kind of ritualized movement, walking the corridors slowly, observing without being observed, adjusting curtains, straightening cushions, checking the lighting. These small gestures were as much about maintaining order as they were about asserting presence. In a world where visibility and invisibility were constantly negotiated, every step was deliberate. In Mughal palaces, certain eunuchs became devoted to small collections, coins, rare manuscripts, or even spices. Each object was carefully catalogued and arranged, not for show, but as a personal anchor in a life of shifting duties. When court politics became tense, or when a prince's temper flared unpredictably, these small systems offered stability, a quiet reassurance that some part of life remained under their control. Tea ceremonies were subtle performances of autonomy. A eunuch might insist that water be boiled precisely, leaves steeped for an exact duration, and cups aligned symmetrically before service. This attention to detail, seemingly trivial, became a ritual of mindfulness, offering a fleeting sense of ownership in a life largely defined by service. Even humor carried a delicate weight. Whispers about the quirks of ministers, the eccentricities of princes, or the absurdities of ceremonial protocol circulated in hushed tones, forming an invisible social network. Jokes were never public, yet they reinforced bonds, eased tension, and allowed eunuchs to retain a sense of agency in private spaces. Friendships were also deeply practical. Alliances offered not just companionship, but also survival. Shared knowledge, warnings, or mentorships could mean the difference between maintaining influence or being sidelined. Rivalries existed, of course, but camaraderie often outweighed competition, especially in the long corridors of palaces where loneliness could be profound. Finally, many eunuchs sought subtle immortality through artistic, architectural, or charitable projects. Gardens, fountains, schools, and religious endowments became lasting testaments to lives lived quietly, yet meaningfully. Without heirs or dynasties, these acts of creation were their way of leaving a trace, a whisper of presence, in a world that often overlooked them. In all these small habits, rituals, and choices, the paradox of the eunuch's life is clear. Intimately entwined with the machinery of empire, yet profoundly isolated. Invisibly powerful, yet conspicuously absent from lineage and public memory. Their lives remind us that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but also by those who move quietly in the spaces between power and privacy. In the Byzantine palaces, some eunuchs became masters of observation. They memorized the habits of courtiers, the schedules of princes, even the smallest shifts in the emperor's mood. A misplaced robe, a slightly crooked tapestry, or an absent candle could signal a change in favor or impending tension. These observations were quiet acts of survival, cultivated over decades of attentive service. In the Ottoman world, some eunuchs developed private habits that were almost meditative. One might trace patterns in the marble floors, noticing subtle color variations. Another might arrange flowers or herbs in the harem gardens with obsessive care, turning routine maintenance into a personal ritual of beauty and control. These small acts offered solace, a sense of self, and a claim to order in an unpredictable palace environment. Food and drink rituals persisted across courts. In Mughal palaces, a eunuch might insist that certain teas be brewed in exact sequences, or that small pastries be arranged in a specific pattern before serving. These practices were not just about taste or display. They were a private assertion of control, a quiet rebellion against a life otherwise dominated by hierarchy and protocol. Friendship and mentorship formed lifelines. Eunuchs taught newcomers the subtle arts of palace navigation, which doors to avoid, how to interpret a gesture from the emperor, and how to maintain influence without overstepping. Bonds were deep, often lasting decades, sometimes becoming the closest thing to family in a life defined by absence of kin. Humor remained a soft but vital undercurrent. Whispers about the eccentricities of ministers, the oddities of court ceremonies, or the absurdities of princes' behavior circulated in hushed tones. These jokes were never recorded in official histories, yet they shaped social life within palaces, offering relief, solidarity, and subtle resistance to rigid hierarchies. Even with all these rituals, observations, and relationships, eunuchs were acutely aware of their paradoxical existence, close to absolute power, yet structurally excluded from lineage. Indispensable, yet often invisible in historical memory. Their lives were lived in the quiet in-between spaces, corridors, chambers, gardens, where influence and isolation existed side by side. And that's enough for today. Now give your eyes some rest and drift off to sleep. Good night.